On 24th March 2025, a group chat discussion that involved Vice President J.D. Vance, Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, the Middle East and Ukraine negotiator Steve Witkoff, Susie Wills, and Marco Rubio was leaked by an editor from The Atlantic. It is not clear exactly what was in the messages, as most of them were deemed too sensitive for public consumption, and so most of them have not been released. But from the text we do see, they have a telling story. From the leaked texts, we see high-ranking officials basically high-fiving each other over the war of aggression against Yemen, a war fought on behalf of Israel, a war of aggression that surprisingly J.D. Vance was against and thought was a mistake. Also, we see Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth attack American allies in Europe and reveal U.S. plans for the war against Yemen. A high-risk blunder by high-ranking officials that should lead to sacking, but Trump has stuck by his guns and defended those who formed the chat. Yemen has attacked Israel directly, as well as engaged in retaliatory strikes against American vessels, an act that the Yemen people have paid for with their lives and livelihood. On the side of Yemen, this is a war fought on behalf of the Palestinian people, who are currently being massacred by the tens of hundreds in mere days, with the aims of leveling Gaza to the ground so as to occupy and rebuild after the forceful eviction of the natives of the land. But on the side of the US, a war fought for the puppeteers of the American establishment and the true deep state. Since the time of our previous video on this topic, more messages have surfaced in what has now been dubbed Signalgate. There are 7 screenshots available to the public, all of which Attorney General Pam Bondi has publicly said are not classified. In the first screenshot we see, it was in fact National Security Advisor Mike Waltz that formed the group, then added in key governmental officials. Those officials included Vice President J.D. Vance, Tulsi Gabbard, Scott B. of the Treasury, and Pete Hegseth. In the second screenshot, we see why VP J.D. was opposed to the strikes on Yemen, as 3% of U.S. trade runs through the Suez Canal, and strikes on Yemen could raise oil prices. And so he wanted those strikes delayed by at least a month. In the third screenshot, Joe Kent assures VP J.D. that there was nothing time-sensitive in regard to potential strikes on Yemen, and also Israel would be attacking them regardless, with or without the US, and so they would need US backing and arms to replenish the ones they used. John Ratcliffe, head of the CIA, said the CIA was mobilizing assets to support an attack on Yemen, which would target Houthi leadership, and delay would only aid in properly identifying their targets. Hegseth of the DoD admitted they didn't know who they were attacking, but he puts the blame squarely on the previous administration and goes on to state the mission they have at hand goes beyond the Houthis, but rather to re-establish freedom and deterrence. In the fourth screenshot, Pete says he's open to other thoughts, after which Michael Waltz states trade figures that go through the Red Sea and around the Cape of Good Hope. He goes on to admit the Houthis have sophisticated weaponry and are a formidable adversary, which is the primary reason Israel convinced the US to fight this war for them, as the Zionists prefer genocidal warfare against people that can't fight back. In that same fourth screenshot, Mike Waltz says it's the United States' job to reopen the shipping lanes, and the costs associated will be placed on European nations. In the fifth screenshot, VP JD tells Pete to go with his best judgment in regard to strikes on Yemen, and that he hates bailing out European nations, who Mike earlier said must raise their defense budget. JD also mentions that any potential military strikes must avoid Saudi oil facilities. Later on in this same screenshot is material covered in the previous video, whereby Pete shares JD's loathing of Europe and agrees with Mike that the US is the only one that can keep the Suez open for trading ships to pass through. Now in the sixth screenshot, we see from Pete a team update whereby he actually gives timestamps on weapons, drones, missiles, and warcraft used on the assault on Yemen. He then blesses those that undertake the attack, which JD prays for. The seventh and last screenshot. Mike Waltz confirms the collapse of a building due to an American attack. Within the building were targets identified by the CIA and probably the Mossad. Also, Waltz notes the person killed was a quote, top missile guy who they bombed a whole residential building to kill. JD responds positively to this news. So does Herxath, Suzuwheels, and 3 others on the chat. These chats reveals Trump's true agenda, an agenda to put Israel first in all matters of faith and practice. That is why he is willing to arrest and deport those within the US that critique Israel or bomb Yemen for standing against Israeli genocide in Gaza, and explains why Trump is now willing to start a war with Iran, a potential disastrous war that only Israel would benefit from. Syria is now a failed state run by lunatics and extremists. Lebanon is bombed by Israel relentlessly, and Gaza is facing unimaginable conditions due to Israeli oppression, which is why Bibi was charged and is wanted by the ICC. But all this is given a blind eye by Trump and those within his Israel First administration.
I'm hopeful about Israel because my people, the Jewish people, emerged from the depths of hell